This is Saad. I am sorry that I couldn't make it today to the conference, but I'm happy to be able to participate. The title of my talk today is The Slow Eradication of Freedom of Speech in Canada. Let me begin by telling you briefly about my personal history. I was born in Lebanon in 1964 to a Lebanese Jewish family. We were part of the last group of Jews that had remained in Lebanon. And the image that you see on the left is the Lebanon that I was born to, and then the one on the right is the Lebanon that I escaped from and came to Canada in 1975 after experiencing the brutality of the first year of the Civil War in Lebanon. Now, growing up in Lebanon, you were always confronted with the possibility of genocidal Jew hatred. So here's a first example of such a reality. When I was 5 years old, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt, had passed away. He was much revered in the Arab world because he was a pan-Arabist, trying to unify all the Arab people under one block, if you'd like. And when he died, as often happens in the Middle East, there was a procession, there was a street demonstration, and during the street demonstration, as they came by our house in the thousands, marching and lamenting the fact that he had passed away, I could hear as a 5-year-old boy, as I cowered behind the balcony, "Death to Jews, death to Jews." So this is the reality that we grew up in Lebanon, that we grew up with. When I was about 8 or 9 or possibly 10, this is an actual photo from my childhood, one of the class photos. The teacher had asked us to take turns stating what it is that we wanted to be when we grew up. And then you got the typical answers. I want to be a policeman, I want to be a soccer player, maybe I want to be a nurse. And then one of the kids in that photo, I won't point him out, although maybe he should be outed, stated, "When I grow up, I want to be a Jew killer," to which the class erupted in laughter and raucous clapping. So that's the world that I grew up in. Now, I had escaped that world. I came to Canada. I was very proud to be Canadian, to be in a free society. And for many, many years, the Middle East did not follow me in Canada. Irrationality, tribalism did not follow me. But on a separate note, moving away a bit from the Middle East, what I did started noticing is that there was a ever-increasing stifled environment of free speech on university campuses. For those of you who don't know, I'm a chaired professor at Concordia University in Montreal, and I started noticing that there were an increasing number of forces that made it difficult for people to express themselves openly, not just about Islam, but about sex differences, about the importance of biology when it comes to human affairs, which is the area that I focus in my scientific research. And so I became increasingly concerned, in addition to, as my, I wear a hat as a scientist, but I also started engaging the public about some of these dangers that I was seeing across Canada, but certainly within the academic ecosystem. This unwillingness to accept unencumbered freedom of speech, but rather you were always stifled. Well, I wasn't, but certainly most of my colleagues were. Here is a Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms report from 2015 where they ranked, or they scored 55 Canadian universities on 4 metrics: how free their university policies are, their university practices, their student union policies, and their student union practices. So there were 55 times 4 different scores, so 220 possible grades, only 8 scores of A meaning the most free, F meaning the worst. So there were 8 A's and 41 F's. This is in Canadian universities. So freedom of speech is under attack in every outlet where you would expect that there'd be a vigorous defense of freedom of speech. Now, some of you may have heard that on August 22nd, 2017, myself and 3 other speakers were set to speak at an event hosted by Ryerson University in Toronto. The title of the event was the stifling of free speech on university campus. Well, guess what happened to that event? It was shut down. I guess the irony is lost on a lot of people. An event titled "The Stifling of Free Speech on University Campus" was stifled fully, permanently, fatally. Not only that, I have here for you two screenshots from the people who shut us down. They're the Antifa type of folks. They accused us of being Nazis, white supremacists, anti-Semites, and then eventually they added also transphobic and Islamophobic for good measure. So a Lebanese Jew with olive skin is apparently a white supremacist neo-Nazi. This is the ecosystem that we live in. This is the system in which something like M103 is allowed to flourish. I love this cartoon because it perfectly captures the reality that we're now facing. You have a person who is beating someone wearing a free speech shirt with his sign of tolerance. So I will beat you to death because that's how tolerant I am. Of course, the leader of that ship of lunacy is none other than Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Some of you might remember that when he was a parliamentarian, the Harper government had put out a Discover Canada booklet passage. I'll read it for you. Canada's openness and generosity do not extend to barbaric cultural practices that tolerate spousal abuse, honor killings, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, or other gender-based violence. And Justin Trudeau's first sort of instinctual reflexive reaction is that he was upset, he was disgusted, he was angry that the word barbaric would be used. So he wasn't angry at the barbaric, inhumane practices, but rather that we would label them as barbaric. He then tried to walk back that statement when he got a lot of blowback, but that first response is the one that's most telling. It comes, of course, from this idea of cultural and moral relativism. Who are we to judge the honorable and noble practices of other people, especially if the other people are perceived to be brown people? And this is another one of these beautiful, one image tells is as good as 1,000 words. We condemn freedom of speech that hurts other people's feelings. No. Freedom of speech is there not to tell you that you've got beautiful green eyes. It's there to exactly protect you from saying, in being allowed to say things that will upset others. That's why we have freedom of speech. Now, to give you a sense of the unbelievable desire to identify, quote, Islamophobia, since we're talking about M103 in all places, Anisa Rouhani, a few years ago, she was a student at Queen's University, she decided to run an experiment where she donned the hijab for 18 days to examine how people would respond to her. Because, of course, she was hoping to identify rampant Islamophobia and bigotry and racism and hatred, all these in quotes, of course, all over the place. But then, of course, she was very surprised that people were incredibly kind and tolerant and sweet to her. And so what did she conclude? Aha! Being kind and tolerant was a form of, quote, racism, because what else could explain the fact that people were so sweet and nice and respectful and tolerant and kind other than to suppress? They were overcompensating for their latent Islamophobia by being overtly kind. So if you are unkind to someone wearing a hijab, you're an Islamophobe. If you are kind to someone wearing a hijab, you're an Islamophobe. Yeah, M103 sounds like a really great idea. Now, I'm going to read to you next these words that only a grotesque Islamophobe could have uttered. So please bear with me as I read these. The flow of immigration into Canada from around the world, and in particular the flow from Muslim countries, means a pouring in of numbers into a liberal society of people from cultures at best non-liberal. But we know through our studies and observation that the illiberal mix of cultures poses one of the greatest dilemmas and an unprecedented challenge to liberal societies such as ours, when there is no demand placed on immigrants any longer to assimilate into the founding liberal values of the country to which they have immigrated. Instead, a misguided and thoroughly wrong-headed policy of multiculturalism encourages the opposite. We should not allow bureaucratic inertia to determine not only the policy, but the existing level of immigrant numbers and source origin that Canada brings in annually. We have the precedent of how we selectively closed immigration from the Soviet bloc countries during the Cold War years, and we need to consider doing the same in terms of immigration from Muslim countries for a period of time, given how disruptive is the cultural baggage of illiberal values that is brought in as a result. So this individual is saying, please halt Islamic immigration into Canada. Now, this person would surely be in trouble according to M103 or any eventual bills that might pass as law to, stop rampant Islamophobia in Canada. That condition that doesn't exist. Who is this Nazi, this white supremacist, this Islamophobe? Well, I present you Professor Salim Mansour's speech before the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration at the House of Commons, Parliament of Canada on October 1st, 2012. Now, in case you can't see well, he is an Indian man who is a practicing Muslim. So a practicing Muslim appears in front of the Canadian government to say, hey, we need to stop this unfettered immigration. What happens to him under M103 or the future bill that is passed to curb Islamophobia? Do we send him to Gulag 13? Let's look at some other horrifying Islamophobes. Now, I won't read this whole quote. I've provided it for you here, but I'll read only the start and the end of it. Islam makes it incumbent on all adult males, provided they are not disabled and incapacitated, to prepare themselves for the conquest of other countries so that the writ of Islam is obeyed in every country in the world. Then he goes on to describe how Islam is hardly a peaceful religion, and then he basically ends with, he spits on anyone who says otherwise. Now, who is this Islamophobe bigot who knows nothing about Islam, who, according to M103, should be feathered and tarred? Oh yes, Ayatollah Khomeini, who of course is a rabid Islamophobe. Let's go on with a few other Islamophobic folks. I'm going to read you the quotes and then I'm going to identify who they are. If the people of this religion, meaning Islam, are asked about the proof for the soundness of their religion, they flare up, get angry, and spill the blood of whoever confronts them with this question. They forbid rational speculation and strive to kill their adversaries. This is why truth became thoroughly silenced and concealed. Now let's look at the next quote. Islam, this theology of an immoral Arab, is a dead thing. Possibly it might have suited tribes in the desert. It is no good for modern progressive state. God's revelation. There is no God. They are only the chains by which the priests and bad rulers bound the people down. A ruler who needs religion is a weakling. No weaklings should rule. Let's go to the third quote from another Islamophobe. It is the nature of Islam to dominate, not to be dominated, to impose its law on all nations and to extend its power to the entire planet. This guy must really not know Islam, because we know that Islam only preaches love, tolerance, and peace. And then finally, it has been determined by Islamic law that the blood and property of people of Dar al-Harb, meaning all non-Muslims, is not protected. Because they fight against and are hostile towards the Muslims, they annulled the protection of his blood and his property. Who are these Islamophobes? They must be Trump supporters. I see no other possibility. They must be neo-Nazis. Oh yes, here are the bigoted Islamophobes. Abu Bakr Muhammad al-Razi, look him up on Google. And then the president of Turkey that introduced secularism in Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And then Sheikh Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, who probably knows nothing about Islam. He must be an Islamophobe. And then the fourth quote is from Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who is arguably the leading Sunni cleric in the world. And again, undoubtedly, he is an Islamophobe who knows nothing about Islam. This type of political correctness where you are stifled from speaking the truth regarding realities that are as clear as the existence of gravity is what causes people, in this next slide, it doesn't matter if you can't see all of the writing, I have listed 67 countries from around the world that vary in every possible way. I have listed those countries because they've all been attacked violently in the name of Islam. In other words, there have been 31,000 plus terror attacks since 9/11 alone in these countries that could not be any different from one another. Most of the bien-pensants don't in any way link it to any religious ideology. Rather, they offer the list that I show you here on the right-hand side, things like beard bullying, lack of art exposure, and climate change, and solar panels, and carbon emission levels as the reason for these attacks. I'm not being facetious. Otherwise, supposedly smart people have proposed that these are the reasons why these terror attacks are happening. In case you're interested, I've listed a whole bunch of these different reasons for you. Now, what is political correctness? Political correctness, I've argued, I've analogized it to the spider wasp's sting, right? The spider wasp stings the spider, rendering it zombified. It then takes it into its burrow and lays its egg on it in vivo so that as the eggs hatch, they can eat the spider in vivo. That's what political correctness is. That's what M103 is. It leads us into the burrow of infinite darkness quietly while we're eventually consumed at one's leisure. Let me draw a couple of other analogies that are very apropos here regarding M103. In marketing, there's the concept of the just noticeable difference. The idea is, for example, that if you take this candy bar, you want to increase the price. Well, if you increase the price, consumers will notice. So what you want to do instead is reduce the weight of the candy bar. But you want to reduce the weight in such a manner that consumers won't notice. So you might go from 100 grams to 95 grams. No one will notice, and hopefully you've, in a sense, implemented your price increase. Or the example, the parable of the boiling frog. If you throw the frog when the water is already boiling, it's going to try to jump out of the pan. But if you put it in the pan and then bit by bit incrementally increase the temperature of the water below the just noticeable difference, then it might not pick up that it's being boiled alive. That's what M103 does. That's what these slow incursions do. They keep us numb, they fall below our just noticeable difference, and slowly we are led to the abyss of infinite darkness. So what do I conclude here? What are some things that we should walk away with? Well, freedom of speech is everything. Islamophobia is a made-up term meant to curb and eventually eliminate criticism of Islam in the West. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation has been engaged in a long and insidious project to pass global blasphemy laws to protect Islam from any critical scrutiny. To state that criticism of Islam is racist is as nonsensical as to argue that your disdain for broccoli is, quote, homophobic. Islam is not a race, it's a set of ideas. In a free society, we should be allowed to criticize it, just like we should criticize Judaism, communism, a scientific theory, a belief system. Everything is open for discussion and criticism. An Islamophobe, typically a kafir, is any individual who knows the full reality about Islam. The only way to avoid an Islamophobia charge is to always praise, respect, and celebrate the religion. Anything at any time could be construed as Islamophobic. If everything is potentially Islamophobic, nothing is Islamophobic. Do not cede a single inch to any ideology that is antithetical to our secular, modern, and liberal, not faux liberal, but liberal values. All ideas, beliefs, and ideologies are open to criticism, debate, mocking, ridicule, and other forms of scrutiny. Protect individuals, but never ideas, and certainly never religions. They don't hold a special place where they can't be touched. Eradicate hate speech laws. Short of direct incitement to violence, defamation, or libel, freedom of speech is absolute. As an example, to show you that I walk the walk and talk the talk, I'm a Jewish person who supports the right of Holocaust deniers to spew their nonsense. So even though it is a grotesque manifestation of one's freedom of speech, they're allowed to exist in a free society, even though they are profoundly offensive to me. Thank you for listening. Have a nice conference.